Perché dopo il tuo primo libro, Giaguaro nel corpo, farfalla nel cuore, in cui hai raccontato la tua iniziazione, hai deciso di scrivere Shaman, che è invece un manuale pratico per lo sciamanesimo quotidiano?
Thank you for the question. In fact, it was an invitation from my publisher who came to see me and said, we've been thinking about what would be the next project for you to do. And we discovered that there isn't a book that just has the title Shaman. Would you be willing to write such a book? And I I really took 2 or 3 months to think about it, and I went into ceremony really to ask, because to write that book for the Western world was really for me to tell the story of what's happened to our own shamans in Europe, to our own earth-based indigenous tradition. Why is it that they are either so underground or were destroyed? And this really brought me to the essence of the work that Susannah and I do, which is to follow up the invitation of all the indigenous teachers we've had, which is don't become like us. You know, you're a Jewish guy who was born in Liverpool. You're not an Amazonian shaman. You won't be. Uh, but your job is to take your experiences, what you learned with us, what you learned in the north of Europe with the Sami, what you learned with different traditions, and translate it into a contemporary form of shamanic practice that's for people who grew up and were educated in the industrial world. That means we've been educated into the idea that our minds, our thinking, is the only reality that matters. And so the disease of the modern world is to be disconnected from the physical realm of the body, from the emotional intelligence of the heart. And movement medicine, which is a contemporary, shamanic, embodied practice, addresses the wounds and therefore the potential medicine of our own culture. And when I prayed about it, I had quite some doubts, like, wow, it's a big task. But when I prayed about it, it was very clear to me that this book, in a way, had already been written. It had been written in the 30 years of practice that my wife and I had been engaged in through our work. And it felt very important to break down the topic of the shaman and what is their role in the modern world. Like, what's like in the modern world where we have everything digital and everything immediate, what's the role of the the person in the community or even within the psyche who is in touch with the cycles of life, with the seasons, with our relationship with who came before us, with our relationship with the generations that will follow, our responsibility as human beings. And finally, I have been very aware that so much of what is taught as shamanic practice in the modern world, one, it's indigenous, and that's a wonderful gift that we live in times where many indigenous people have recognized that we need what they know. And so they have taken that huge risk to bring their work to us. But again, we have to translate it. And a lot of what gets taught in the name of shamanism is really about very far out, esoteric, exotic experiences that have very little connection with our day to day life. There's very little attention paid to integration because indigenous peoples, they live in an integrated culture. Shamanism is part of their everyday life. It's not something that they do at weekends. It's a paradigm through which they understand their place in nature, in the spirit world, in the universe. And in the Western world, we'd really not made that connection. Movement medicine addresses that. It's really about the wisdom that exists in the bone, in the blood, in the fascia, in the cellular structure, in the intelligence of the heart. And it comes together when body and heart and mind are connected. And that's the basis of our work. And it's really, in my opinion, what needs to be the basis of shamanic practice for those educated and brought up in the industrial world.
Chi è uno sciamano nella sua essenza?
The shaman, they have that wider view of life. They see the development of the human being and the community and the relationships with land and the relationships with ancestors and the relationship with purpose. And they provide spaces in which an individual can discover for themselves through their own connections who they are, what really matters to them, what their purpose is, and how that connects to their community, not just the human community, but the biosphere that we rely on. Shamans were the original system thinkers. They understood the human role as part of the system of life itself. So now the inner shaman does that within the psyche. The shaman, as a role in the modern world, does that for their community. They help us to remember our mortality, that you cannot guarantee that when you wake up in the morning that you will live for the rest of the day, or when you fall asleep at night that you will wake up in the morning. This is something that we take for granted, and in the modern world we're always surprised by mortality. It always comes as a shock to us when we are confronted by the loss of a friend or by our own mortality. The shaman knows this because they exist in that place that's in between the physical manifestation of life and the dream of life. They exist right in that space, a foot firmly in both worlds. The non-physical, the dream of life and how that affects our experience, and the physical existence that we live inside. And without it, watch the news tonight and you see what happens to a culture that forgets the importance of structured initiation for its young people, of regular ceremony to give thanks for the bounty of earth and sun and rain and wind and trees and the animal world and the plant world. They are the part of us that remembers that life is a sacred gift that we are given and that it's up to us to make something from it of value so that what we receive from our ancestors we can pass on to those who will follow. And that's the role of the shaman. They're not just interested in this life, this day, me, myself. They're interested in the community of life and the well-being of that community, and each of us learning our place within it.
Shaman è incentrato sull'archetipo universale dello sciamano interiore. Come sei arrivato a questa comprensione, al punto da farne l'architrave del libro?
What really matters to me is that shamanism is accessible to as many people as possible. And not everyone is going to be a shaman. That's not the point of shamanism, that everyone becomes a shaman. However, everyone can make benefit from this inner archetype, this part of them that already knows its connection to earth, to the light of the sun, to the changing seasons, to the dance of our well-being, the development of a human soul over decades. And I really wanted people, the readers of this book, to be able to relate this role to their day-to-day lives, to their work, to their relationships, to their families, to their sense of purpose, to their sense of belonging, to their sense of potential joy and contentment and peace as a human being in a troubled world. And my experience of working with that archetype internally is so strong and helpful in the way that I dream, in the way that I begin my day when I wake up in the morning, my first thoughts, my first actions of the day. They're all guided by that archetypal sense of remembering connection. This is our modern, really difficult challenge that so many people face, is a loss of connection to themselves, to each other, to a sense of purpose, to their inner strength, to their resources that we are made from as human beings. So, the essence of our work is to encourage people to stand up, to grow up, and to play their role. And the inner shaman is a vital presence in the psyche that can support that process with kindness, with humor, with spiritual wisdom, with connection to our dreaming, our non-physical world, the imaginal world, and the effect of building that connection between the part of us that dreams and the part of us that lives day to day. The effect of that is that the dream of our life and the actuality of our life, instead of being very far apart, start to come closer together. I'm thinking of that Sistine Chapel image. We think of that as our divine purpose, that the inner shaman knows how to create spaces in which we remember that connection, whether you call it God or the Virgin Mary or Arutam or whatever name you have for it. It's that sense of the divine miracle of life itself that's in us and beyond us. And the book really takes people step by step through that process.
Che cos'è il sé indigeno di cui accenni brevemente nel libro?
So the indigenous self is that part of us that lives in the land of our own bodies, like really lives within the physical structure of our flesh and our muscles and our bones and our organs and our hunger and our desire and our senses. And through being so deeply engaged in the body and its capacity to be connected, to be interoceptively connected to our inner worlds. And through that, we are immediately connected to the land. And when we connect to the land of our bodies, we start to remember the importance of our ancestors, our homelands, or the land that we've chosen to live on, or we've had to choose to live on in some cases. This reminds us of a sense of belonging, not just to our blood family, but to the family of life where we live. And if we keep really following that, that goes right down into the microorganisms of our own physical structure. That, you know, most of our physical structure is not even human. It's all kinds of beings that we are made up from. And to be awake to that extraordinary, miraculous complexity of what this is, this living, animate being, is to be indigenous to our own bodies through that, our own really real and genuine sense of self, through that, our sense of purpose, through that, our sense of strength and direction and medicine. So to be indigenous really means to belong.
Che ne pensi del fenomeno del neo-sciamanesimo occidentale, quando non è supportato da una reale connessione con le comunità indigene originarie? Per esempio, ci sono alcuni occidentali che guidano cerimonie di ayahuasca e magari non sono mai stati in Amazzonia e non hanno mai partecipato a un rituale tradizionale. Quali sono i rischi di una situazione del genere?
The risks are severe. And first of all, we have to understand that in the modern world, in our industrial landscape, there is a deep hunger for connection, meaning, purpose, community, ritual. So there is a deep hunger for that that's beyond the traditional religion that have been, they have their own story. But there's the power of traditional religions has lessened, has faded away in many ways. So there is this vacuum, this hunger for experience of the divine. And within individuals, there is this hunger for a sense of the magical, the miraculous, the spiritual, the actual experience of spiritual life. That not the being told it's like this and do this, but the actual embodied experience. So it's not surprising that ayahuasca, which is a vine, and a vine grows on other structures, it's not surprising that that particular plant and many others have become so popular and so widespread in the modern world. However, without training, without real training, what those people are doing is opening people to a spiritual space in which all kinds of things are going on. Imagine it like the busiest motorway at rush hour. That's the spiritual realm when you take psychedelics. There's everything going on, everything within the psyche, everything in the land where you are, everything in the people that you're with, all the family history, all the intergenerational history, all the stories, all the spirits who want to be heard and listened to. It's a psychic traffic jam. And just because things are in spirit, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have our well-being as their main interest. Some beings just want to be heard, and what they're saying may be important to them, but may have nothing to do with us. This is why in indigenous communities, a training for a shaman takes decades. They go on training their whole life. The shamans who we work with, the elders in the Amazon, they've been running ceremonies for 60 years. They still go to see other shamans to discuss and learn together and share experience. They never believe like, I've got this, I'm done. That's a very Western approach. Like, well, I did this, and this, therefore I'm able to do that. And I'm done with all of that. So sadly, we see many people who are taken to places by people without the skill to hold them there. And the effects of that can be really catastrophic for people. And again, if the person holding that ceremony is not in touch with the traditions and the people from whom that tradition comes, and they are not giving back to that tradition, I would walk 1,000 miles in the opposite direction of that person. If you're invited to such a ceremony, find out who are their people, who's given them the authority or the permission or the blessing to hold that space. How are they giving back? To what communities are they supporting? Or are they just taking, like we tend to do, and commercializing and consuming, just like we do with everything else? So it's a balance, because, I don't want people to be terrified of, oh my God, psychic traffic jams. At the same time, I don't want people to be naive and to recognize that to work in those realms requires incredible integrity. And we can't always expect that from Indigenous people either. Sadly, an Indigenous shaman's training doesn't teach them about power dynamics, doesn't teach them how to deal with young, needy, wounded people seeing this exotic, amazing, colorful being who's given them this incredible experience, who they fall in love with and want to give themselves to. The shamans are not trained in how to be with that, how to manage that. So that leads to problems too. So the last thing I'll say about this is that for Indigenous people that I work, if they work with that particular medicine, ayahuasca, they might, unless they're training as a shaman, they might do 3, 4, maybe 5 ceremonies in their whole life, because they wouldn't consider going and doing another ceremony if they've received a vision and not done the work to make that vision part of their day-to-day life. That's the purpose of these plants, of these keys, is that they open a door. They show you the work that you need to do in your day-to-day life to make that vision an everyday reality. That's what they're for. And the Indigenous people I work with, they also recognize that we come often wounded. And so they understand that we might need more ceremonies than that, because there is, in the foundations of our psyches, the presence of a loving mother, the presence of a kind, disciplined, friendly father is not always there in the structure of our modern psyche. And that is very difficult for us human beings, because we're always then fighting for a sense of growing up, until we recognize that whatever our own mother did or didn't give us, whatever our own father did or didn't give us, the great mother, the great father are here every day, giving us all that we need to live. So it's a lot to do with integration. That's the key element missing. Integration with day-to-day life.
Rispetto all'utilizzo delle piante sacre, hai la percezione che i benefici siano maggiori dei rischi? Quali sono i rischi e quali i benefici?
Well, the risks are that we get addicted to the experience. Like we want that high. I mean, human beings are like that. We want these peak experiences. Of course we do. And so we mistake the experience for the medicine. The medicine is what we do with the experience. And then for some people who don't have a sense of boundary or a sense of ground in their beings, they can become less and less grounded in their lives. They become more dreamy, more out of body, more in the imaginal realms, and less available as a human being. And that is sadly part of what can happen. However, the benefits are they are our human evolution. Plant medicine, those plants, those sacred plants are keys. They're keys for the soul. They are initiations for us to unlock something within us that maybe we didn't even know was locked. Maybe we didn't even know there was a door there that was closed. These sacred plants help us to see what is hidden from us. You might say it's in the roots of our being, waiting for the light of some illumination to help us to see, this place within me is closed. And that experience with that plant unlocked that door and helped me to perceive myself, my history, my family history, my people's history, my purpose, my sense of who I am. They can give us that moment, or even more than moment, of direct experience. And plants are incredibly helpful and generous in that way. And, you know, I will say that the deepest plant medicine is the material of our own bodies and what we eat, how we eat, how we prepare our food. That's plant medicine. How, um, aromatherapy is plant medicine. Plants have many incredible gifts in our lives, not just with psychedelics. In psychedelics, thank goodness, we're coming into a time once again where now the research is opening up again about how we can use psychedelics with really good psychotherapy and in safe, structured places to support people who are really locked in to be able to heal. And that's a wonderful thing that that's happening alongside indigenous wisdom. My dream is that the scientific world and the shamanic world, at some point soon, really integrate what they know into a holistic way of working with these plants and substances for the benefit of the individual, the community, and for the biosphere that we depend on.
Nella tua esperienza è possibile che uno sciamano possa manipolare le persone e usarle per i suoi scopi attraverso un processo di vampirizzazione? O c'è sempre un consenso conscio o inconscio della vittima?
Well, for sure, anyone with power can abuse power. And if they're not engaged with elders, mentoring, community mirroring, if they're not part of a structure in which the person with power can be challenged, then sadly it's quite likely that that person with power may well end up abusing it. Is the person who ends up being abused by that solely a victim, or do they have some choice? On a human level, just on a human level, so anyone coming in to a situation where they are being told they can trust the holding that's being offered, they are a victim of that person's bad behavior. If that person doesn't hold a clean and consensual space, then they are the victim of that. On a spirit level, on the level of if that person who has been victimized is on a spiritual journey and they are given resources and support to see that experience in the bigger picture of their life, they can transform the meaning of that experience from having been the victim of somebody else's bad behavior to having learned something that can be part of their own medicine and their own empowerment. But that requires a resource for that person. It requires acknowledging the wound that that person has experienced. And it requires a journey of helping that person to feel the emotion connected to that experience so that they can find their voice again. They can find their no really clearly, that their fire, their fury at what may have happened to them. And through that, the grief of that loss of trust, that loss of faith, and through that process, which also acknowledges the fear of being in that situation, through that, any human being has the capacity to rise from the ashes of suffering and, like Phoenix medicine, can be reborn, strengthened by it. And I'm really blessed to have witnessed that on so many thousands of occasions with people who have suffered enormous cruelty and yet who have managed to turn that around and make that cruelty into medicine. And so if there is somebody who's listening to this, who's had that experience, don't give up. You do not have to wear that identity of being a victim for the rest of your life. There is help, there is support, and there is the possibility, not just of healing, but of genuine empowerment that you can extract from that very, very difficult and tragic situation that you may have lived through.